Bow your head. Heavenly Father, Lord, we just thank you that we can just take time to study, Lord, the world that you've placed us in, Lord God, and the cultures that are within it, Lord. Lord, I just pray that you can just open our minds, Lord, and just take this as an opportunity to better understand the people that we're around, Lord, and understand how we can reveal your truth to them, Lord, and understand their cultures, and understand how we can communicate to them clearly, Lord, and efficiently, Lord, and all of this bring glory unto you. Lord, we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay. So we are presenting over culture and identity, and this is in chapter 7 of our book. So if you have it, you can turn there for reference. So to start off, we're going to tell you a little bit about our own personal cultural background. So I'm Michelle, and I'm from Guatemala, but I've lived in Texas before, and then I'm here.
Okay. My name's Gabe. I was born and raised in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. So that would be in the southwest region of the United States, to be specific.
My name's Audrey, and I was born in McAllen, Texas, which is 10 minutes from the border of Mexico. So I was in the States, but it was like very Mexicanized culture, so it was really different.
My name is Oswald. I'm from Ghana, West Africa, where God lives, and visit the island.
I'm Laura Rosales, and I was also born in McAllen, Texas. And yeah, it's very Mexican down there.
My name is Kira, and I'm from Iowa, which is like smack in the middle of the U.S., so I say things like y'all, but I also call like my mom ma'am, and I say pants instead of pants. So just right in the middle, got both sides.
All right. So even if in our group you can see that there's a lot of different cultural backgrounds that are identified. So we're going to be learning a little bit more about that. So our next slide. This one? Down.
Point at the computer.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. So I'm going to be talking to you about the role of identity. Formation of identity is a principal objective of adolescent years. As we all know, our teenage years are super important, and our brain during that time is still developing and forming and adapting to who we are becoming. And so it's super important and crucial for our identity to start developing and reach like a point of full development during this time, because there was a research that said that teenagers who didn't develop their identity during this time struggle later on in life with finding out who they are in the world and what they're supposed to do. So I thought that was really interesting. And identity, as we all know, has become more and more of an important factor in how we live and whom we associate with. I think that how we live, our identity plays a great role in how we live, because we were all created unique by God and special and in different ways, and we all have something interesting about us that not everyone else does. And so we accommodate with each other, and we bring to the table things that other people don't, and this also affects like our relationships and who we hang out with or who we relate with, and end up marrying, or what kind of culture we end up staying with. So our identity is really important. Oh, going the other way. Okay. So why is this important for us to know as a class? In the book, this is a quote that I found, and it says that our cultural identity guides expectations about your own and others' social roles and provides the guidelines for communication with others. And an example of the social roles and how identity and culture affects is classrooms in the USA versus classrooms in Japan. This was an example from our book, but I also read a lot about this online. And it was basically talking about how in Japan, classrooms are teacher-centered, and in the USA, they're student-centered. This means that here in America, students can participate and be involved in the discussion. The teachers and professors expect the students to raise your hands and ask questions and just be involved. While in Japan, it's very teacher-centered, so students aren't really allowed to have much of a say, and they're normally quiet and just very respectful of the professor. So this can be something that could be a problem when a Japanese student comes to America and the professor is expecting them to be involved in the class, and they're not, because part of their culture is to respect and to not ask that many questions or interrupt, and so that has a very important effect. So these examples demonstrate the importance of understanding the role of identity in an intercultural situation. That's what that would be called if a student from a different country would come in here. So then we have examples of social issues of identity. The first one is racial identity. This is a social construct arising from historical attempts to classify people into different groups. This is more of your biological ancestry, and it was early on. It was used to to show how Europeans were above Africans or Native Americans and things like that. And it's based on your external physical traits, such as your skin color, your hair texture, your eye shape, your facial appearance. So here we have different races and ethnicities, which we'll learn more about ethnicities later. And just wanted to do a quick run through to see how many different races are represented in the class. So if you are of American Indian or Alaskan Native, raise your hand. 1. Cool. Asian? Or was there 2? Asian.
1.
Black or African American? 1, 2. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander? White. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Wow. And Hispanic or Latinos. Woo! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Go, white and Hispanic.
Okay. Interesting. We'll learn about you. Okay. All right. This is also where we get the term racism from, as everyone knows. It is prejudice based on social significant physical features. So, differences between skin color. I don't relate to them because they're white or something like that. So, I make white jokes because I'm Hispanic or things like that. Really racism. Don't do it. So, and then in 2012, this was interesting. There was over 9 million Americans that responded as having 2 or more races. So that would be you, Kyle, part of that. So yeah, that's racial identity. Then we have ethnical identity. This is derived from a sense of shared heritage, history, tradition, values, similar behaviors, areas of origin, and language. Examples of this, in the U.S., would be a German American, a Chinese American, a Mexican American, an Italian American, and different things like that. Sometimes they group together, for example, Chinatown or Little Italy in New York. And in these little areas, their cultural values are more stronger, and they're more connected to their home country. For example, in Chinatown or Little Italy or things like that, they might still speak the language a lot. They will eat their food from home. They will celebrate different traditional cultural celebrate holidays or things like that. Yeah. But something that's interesting is that in this generation, we have moved from trying to stay within our ethnicity to more diverse areas, which has brought a lot of interracial marriages, and that's everyone knows when a white person marries a black person, or a Hispanic marries a white person, or something like that. And so that's been more of a thing in our generation. So that's ethnicity. Then we have gender identity. So for this, we're going to do men and women. How many women do we have in the house? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. That's a lot. And men? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Wow. We have definitely one. Okay. This is socially constructed concept that refers to how a particular culture differentiates masculine and feminine social roles. So this is more of like how a woman should act in like a culture, or how a woman acts in a culture, or how like what a man's role is in a different country, or things like that. So, for example, in Guatemala, where I'm from, women are expected mostly to stay at home and be stay-at-home moms. While here in the U.S., it's very like popular to have women or moms that go out and work. So that'd be a different social role. Also, here in the U.S., men represent less than 6% of nurses. It's really interesting. Also, teachers, like in Guatemala, we barely have like any male teachers, and that's a thing that's starting to like bloom more. So now we have awesome male educators. So in Japan, again, for example, there's like different words that women use and different words that males use for like a certain thing. So I thought that was really interesting. I read this, and it said that some Native Americans accept transgenders and even think that they have special powers. So that's really interesting, social roles. And in South Asia, men who assume feminine identities are seen as having a third gender. So that's very different. So it's very important for us to like know all this and be aware that there's a lot of different social roles that come in with masculine and feminine, those aspects. And then the last one, national identity. This one refers to your nationality or the nation where you were born in. It can also be acquired by immigration or naturalization. So an example would be my grandma. She was born in El Salvador, but then she moved to Guatemala, and she got naturalized or whatever. So she became a citizen of Guatemala. And it also happens like when you marry a person from another country, and you get like double citizenship. This is more pronounced when you are away from your home country. So for example, when my family lived in Texas, there was moments when my dad would sit in his office and listen to the Guatemalan national anthem, which you normally don't do, but because we were away from home, like it reminded him of it, and we would eat Guatemalan food and like look at pictures, and he'd be like, "Oh look, it's home." So that becomes more pronounced when you're away from home. This you can see it in like the World Cup or in the Olympics, where people become very prideful of their countries and do crazy things. There's also a thing called transnational identity, which is when like the borders of like I'm Guatemalan and that's it become broken, and that's where globalization begins. And so like I'm open to other countries and other cultural ideas and things like that. And oh yeah, so we're gonna write down the different nations that we represent in the class. So of course, USA, Guatemala, which should be first. Just kidding. We have Mexico, Oswald, Ghana. India. Do we have another nation represented? Huh? Good. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in our class, so it's really interesting. All right, so now.
Okay. regional identity, and this is something that is very evident here in the United States. But there's some exceptions, like with really tiny countries. They list some countries: Andorra, Liechtenstein, and Monaco.
No.
Yeah. Just kind of show those pronunciations. But like, so basically, this is like subcultures within a large, let's say, country. So there's cultural contrasts, like differences. So that could be dialects or different aspects of language, clothing, customs, ideologies, ideas, convictions. So I'll go through some examples real quick. So what better example than 1970s television? So is anyone familiar with the television show The Dukes of Hazzard? Okay, can you tell us what it's about?
It's about two cousins who go through Georgia and raise a bunch of havoc.
Yeah, it's set in the fictional Duke County of Georgia. And then there is another TV show around the same time called Hawaii Five-0. Now, this is a TV show set in Hawaii, and it consists of lawyers, the justice system, and they're both set in the United States in the 1970s. But just looking at these two pictures, what are two differences, obvious things that you guys see between these pictures?
What they're wearing.
Yeah, exactly. Like you see, he has his shirt buttoned down, cowboy boots. These men are in suits. These are examples of clothing differences. I mean, this is within the United States in the same period of time. Another thing, I mean, maybe we're not familiar with those TV shows unless we watch TV Land, which I sometimes did when I was at my grandparents' house. But think of sodas or pops or Coke. So think in your mind, what would you, like, how many of you would refer to soda as pop? You raise your hand. All right, who would refer to it as soda? Raise your hand. And who would refer to it as Coke? Okay, so now think of your answer. Now, we'll look at this map that was put together by friends at East Central University down at Ada, Oklahoma. And I'm guessing here's the guide. So we can see pop, Coke, soda, and another. So if we can look on the map, chances are there's a possibility that you lined up with that. Maybe not. There could be some exceptions. But this is just an example of just differences within regions within one country. Okay, so we kind of touched on clothing, language, but also there's ideology. We can just look back in history, just a couple hundred years ago within our own country, and there's obviously Civil War. I mean, this is a very infamous thing that happened in our country. And there's a disagreement within ideology, essentially based off of the foundation of the economy, but there's convictions, morals, and disagreement, and ultimately there's a lot of violence, and there was an outcome to that. And a lot of us, we think of civil wars as something that kind of happened in the past, but to tell the truth, that there's a lot of civil wars going on right now. Does anyone know of maybe a conflict going within a country that they're aware of that's going on right now?
Syria?
That is true. That is true. There's one that I think is honestly relevant to us as ORU students. Does anyone know where a lot of our janitors are from?
Burma.
Mm-hmm. A lot, and within Burma or Myanmar, there is a civil war going on right now. A lot of our janitors are refugees because there's a dispute amongst ideology. The ethnic groups and the bordering areas of Burma are wanting democracy. The central government is anti-democracy, and there's a lot of violence, a lot of war, a lot of death going on. So there's an influx, especially in Tulsa, of Burmese refugees. So, and the reason I say that is this is something that's honestly relevant to us here at ORU. I'd say that we should be conscious of how we talk about maybe democracy or concepts, or people. I'd say we should have an understanding of where people are coming from, understand that some topics may be sensitive, especially as Christians. We don't want to turn someone off or say something offensive when we might not understand the weight of a subject has to someone. The next thing So organizational identity, now this is interesting. The textbook gave an example of Japan, USA, and it says in Japan there's a strong sense of identity with the organization you work for, especially kind of with amongst older generations. One illustration they gave was how some Japanese businessmen will wear a lapel pin on their suits representing the company that they work for. Often their name tags will have the name of the company on there. Even when they greet each other, they'll say the name of the company and then their names. And you know, that's apparently that's kind of declining, on the decline now. But there's a great sense of identity found in the company that you work for. Next is personal identities. This is interesting. A lot of this depends on the individualistic or I guess the level of independence amongst the culture. So essentially you could think of like the United States, we may think of ourselves as a Lego block, you know, standalone, what a great Lego block. But in other countries, you may think of yourself as a Lego block as part of like a spaceship made out of Legos. This is an interesting quote which says, people in different cultures have strikingly different construals of the self, of others, and of the independence between the two. So that's personal identity. Now this one's actually really interesting. Cyber identity and fantasy identity. This is, when I first heard about this, I thought, I got this idea of maybe this kid behind a computer screen with a headset on, creating an alternate character of himself. And essentially, what a cyber or fantasy identity is where someone is able to portray themselves on the internet. They're able to pull things out of themselves that they like, maybe never reveal things that they don't like about themselves. And the more I thought about it, it isn't really mentioned in the textbook, but it's something I think is probably really relevant to a lot of us. So I was going to ask, how many of you guys have Instagrams? A lot of us do. So I'm not going to hate on Instagram because I like Instagram. And just for example, we'll look at my Instagram. So I'm not making fun of people. So here's my Instagram. You can follow me at Twitter if you want. So essentially, this is my identity on an app. So let's say we look at one of my pictures. My most recent picture was a picture I took when I went to Thailand this summer. And then we'll look at another picture. And it was a concert I went to, the Hillsong concert that's here on campus. And if we look at my pictures, these are things I've chosen to present to people. So if you buy my Instagram, I look like this world traveler who goes to concerts all the time. And in reality, that's not really who I am. That's a very small portion of who I am. You know, I don't, for example, hypothetically, if I bombed a test, I wouldn't put that on Instagram. You know, there's some cool things about Gabe, but there's some not so cool things about Gabe. But with these cyber identities, we get to choose what we put on there. We get to make ourselves look like we're awesome, you know, and understand that there are some flaws in us, but there's this cyber identity that I didn't even realize I had that I built up for myself. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying we might actually drive a lot of worth amongst ourselves. Even a lot of people we talk to, they might have a lot of their worth within their cyber identity. So that's all that I had about those. So.
I'm focusing on acquiring identity and then how we develop it. So there are three ways by means of which we develop identity. The first one is the family. The family happens to be the basic unit of character formation, values and norms and beliefs. There's an old English adage which says that charity begins from home. So that means that whatever a child becomes, it all begins from the house. Another thing is that when children happen to interact with other family members, they pick up some attitudes and some characters from uncles, aunties, and all those things. And all those things help define the cultural identity of the person. The next thing is the cultural socialization. We all belong to, we go to churches, we go to school, we go for functions and other stuff. In all those processes, we tend to meet people and have interaction with them. From those interactions, you also happen to acquire certain things from the people, and all those things integrate to form part of your culture. The third one is your personal experience. Most of us happen to go through different things, and when you go through a storm or you go through a disaster, you tend to develop some kind of strength, and then if it happens to pull you down, then you develop a weakness. But in all these things, it helps you also develop some important things that build up your identity. Okay. So a scholar called Finney came up with 3 ways. He developed 3 models of explaining the identity stages. The first one, he said, is unexamined ethnic identity. I'd like to take the story of a biblical character, Moses. And when Moses was born, he was taken into the Pharaoh's house. And within the first few years of his life, he didn't know who he was. He had all the comfort of life. He never bothered to ask himself a question. The next phase that we see is that he one day sees somebody, my words are not coming, humiliating an Israelite. And so he questions himself, why is this person having power and authority and dominion over the other person? And so that is the ethnic identity search. He went questioning himself. How come this person is able to express authority over the other person? And then the ultimate or the objective at the end of the day was he found out that no, I don't belong to this group of people, the Egyptians. He was rather an Israelite. And so he was able to obtain his ethnic achievement by helping free the people of Israel from Egypt, from bondage. These 2 scholars also came up with a model. They also classified and then categorized how people will develop their identity based on 3 things. They said you can either be part of a minority group, majority, or biracial. Now, with the minority individuals, they have 4 phases that they go through. The first one is the unexamined identity. First of all, they don't. There's lack of exploration on their part. At a later end, they find out that no, I happen to be a different person, and so the norms of the majority group, they tend to, well, let's go along with what they are saying, or let me try to fit into this group so that I don't feel awkward. And the third phase is resistance and separatism. When they are able to find who they are, they tend to shun the identity of the majority group. And then the last phase is the integration. And, well, they are able to build character, and then they are able to say that, well, I think mine is better, and so I will stick with it. The majority group also goes through the first phase, which is the unexamined identity. And later they happen to find out, well, we are part of a superior group. So let me use Germany as an example, the Nazi Germany. So when Hitler convinced some of the people that you guys belong to the Iron Group, and they accepted their listing, they were so confident about it, and they looked at other races as a minority. And then they developed resistance against them, and later redefined themselves and said, we are the superior people, and therefore we can try and then have a community cleared of other races. So let's get rid of the Jewish people, let's get rid of the black people, let's get rid of, and so on and so. The biracial individual. he goes through 3 phases. He or she goes through 3 phases. First of all, they are conscious of differences in general, and then the potential discord. I'm not biracial, so but let me let me talk from the perspective of a biracial person. He happens to find, well, my mom is white and my dad is black. How did this happen? And then the next phase of it is that he gains awareness. Oh, okay, probably maybe because they were in love, and that's so. I don't care. That's them, and this is me. And the last phase is he or she accepts the reality that my parents are mixed, and I'm unique, and I can function on both sides. Okay, identity is your cultural identity could either be ascribed or avowed, meaning that when it is ascribed, those are things that you don't determine as a person. You are born and then you discover that you are black, your race, you can't do anything about it. Where you were born, those are things that you can't change. If you're a boy, you're a girl, there's nothing that you can change about it. And so those are ascribed. And then if you happen to have an avowed identity, that's something that you chose as a person voluntarily. And so, for example, there's a phase of you that there's a phase that exists of you that goes to school, and then you choose a particular school that you want to go to. And so you can say that I am an Oral Roberts student, which means that you've chosen or ascribed to be an ORU student. Finally, how do we establish and then enact cultural identity? There's some number of ways that we are able to establish our identity through the process of communication. When we happen to interact with others, as earlier on, we pick up stuff from them. And then the next thing is the cultural rites of passage. Who knows what the rites of passages are? Can somebody tell me the rites of? Yep, Kyle.
So it's saying if you're moving from being seen in your community as something, this rite of passage is the ceremony or the social recognition that you're moving from something to something else.
Okay.
So maybe from a boy to a man, or from, a church goer to a church member.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. You gave me part of the answer. The rites of passage: birth, puberty, marriage, death. Those are the 4 rites of passages in life. And so, depending on the culture that you come from, they vary. In Ghana, where I come from, when you're born, there is a special ceremony known as the naming ceremony. Depending on the ethnic group that you also come from. And I happen to, in Ghana, there are about 67, 69 ethnic groups. And we speak different languages, different people. Even though we happen to be all Ghanaians, everybody has a unique way of dressing, a unique way of life. If they are born, the processes that they go through in their naming ceremony is different. If they reach the puberty stage, it's also different. And when we are going to marry to, it's different. And our funeral rites are also different, depending on where you come from. There's also involvement in commemorative events. For example, just a week ago, I think last week, they had Oktoberfest. That is just a festival celebrated by the Germans, St. Patrick by the Irish people. And then people also show their identity in some of these things. And then the languages that we also speak. Well, I speak a number of languages, like 3 different ethnic dialects, which are spoken across Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. And then we have, once a person speaks a particular language, you can associate the person with that. You can associate the identity of the person with that language. Thank you very much.
I'll be not done yet, sorry. I'll be talking about identity and intercultural interactions. So one of the examples we used for this was when people all over the world, because business meetings are held all over the world through conference calls or whatever, like my dad goes to meetings virtually in Europe like once a month. And it's really different because the things that people do that are from different countries can really affect the way your meeting goes. So like if the European countries, the way they greet people oftentimes are by kissing their cheeks. And so if an American older guy got kissed on a cheek by some lady, he'd probably be like really thrown off and be like, hey, what's going on? But like that's just something that they do over there, and so it's something that you need to accept. But so it says, culture has shaped one's understanding and expectations of correct communication practices. What is appropriate in one culture might be inappropriate in another culture. Intercultural competence is adjusting your cultural tradition to those of different countries. So that's why it's so important to be aware of what other cultures, their traditions are, because you kind of need to be able to meet in the middle with other cultures and be able to accept the fact that some lady's going to kiss your cheek, or not be weirded out when a Japanese guy like bows to you or something. Like you just need to know that that's okay. People need to adjust their communication styles to those of another culture, since they're going to be different, and then you need to meet in the middle. Despite the whole world working together, the world is still really diverse. But there is a revival of local cultures coming into all over the world. So like, for example, Chinatown in America. So that's an example of a revival of a local culture in one of the bigger cultures. So it's a place where they can all meet together in the midst of the USA. And something else that's a lot more popular nowadays is multicultural births and immigration, intercultural marriages, and the ease of foreign travel, which is probably one of the biggest ones, because that was not that it wasn't allowed, but it just wasn't as popular at all, and now people travel all over the world all the time. Dual citizenship is more popular in most countries now, just like all of these people over here coming from different countries. And intercultural transits are travelers who regularly alternate reside between their homeland and a host foreign country. So it's like if you go back to Ghana, but you still are living in the USA, it's kind of like they're switching all over the place. So that's what intercultural transit is.
So I'm going to talk about stereotyping. What stereotyping is, it's that in your mind, you start to put characteristics of certain people into little categories. And so whether it be like by race or ethnicity, age, social group, you start developing these little categories in your mind. And I think an obvious example is like high school or middle school. I remember my high school, there was a senior pit, so only seniors were allowed to sit there, and if underclassmen would sit there, we would give them like a stank eye, or like, why are you doing here? This is a senior pit for a reason. Or there's clubs like cheerleading or the drama team, all those things, and then like they just don't really clash well whenever they come together because they have these certain ideas of them. And so these are just examples of stereotypes. So like there's, on the top it says, I'm a teenager, so I must be a trouble causer. I'm skinny, so I must be anorexic. I'm young, so I must be naive. And I'm a girl who actually eats lunch, so I must be fat. These are just like little basic stereotypes that we can come across with. Stereotypes are learned in a variety of ways. How children, they are raised up in their homes, how parents speak about other groups in front of them, or by TV, the mass media. There's a lot of advertising, and just little details in TV that say something or do something negative according to like a particular group. And so when you have these categories in your mind and you stereotype these groups and you bring it into communication, it really changes the way you communicate to them because you have these ideas and stereotypes. They're very firm and they usually can't change. So you come across like women, oh, she can't do it because she's a girl, or like she can't live because she's a girl, or she can't do this because she's a girl. So you start to, you know, having that superiority, is that how you say it? For women. So yeah, I'm gonna do this. And so another negative aspect is prejudice. I think back then it was more being prejudiced was more obvious than now, but it is still existent in our society. An clear example is, you know, the blacks back in the days where they couldn't sit at the front of the bus, or they couldn't get jobs, or children, they couldn't go to schools with white children. And so that's just a clear example of the past and being prejudiced. Even now, since I'm from McAllen, I'm like 10 minutes away from Mexico. And so when I came to ORU, I had practicum, so I would have to go to another school and observe the teacher, observe the children, and just how they behave. And then I would call my mom, and one time I called my mom, and I said, it's because the kids over here, they're so well behaved. And back home, I would work at a daycare. And you see all types of kids going into that daycare. You see teenage mothers, kids that are just grown in a really broken home. Because, I mean, Mexicans, yes, they are family-centered, but they're just very strict and very disciplined with their children, that sometimes they just take it to the extreme and the children just grow up just very broken, and then especially like the rate of being fatherless is very high. So when I came over here and I observed in my practicum, I called my mom one day and I said, because the kids over here are so well behaved, they raise their hand, they don't yell, they don't fight, and they don't say bad words, and they're just so well behaved. And my mom's clear response was, es que la raza, hija. So that over there, la raza, it's like, they're negative thoughts about Mexicans. If you go to Mexico, I would have to go over to Reynosa, which is in Mexico, for my braces. And every time I would go, I would be scared because it's just really, in that little pueblito Reynosa, it's just really dirty and messy, and you see a lot of stuff, so you get really tensed up when you're walking there. But that's just, you're just doing a prejudice over Reynosa. Like, not all people in Mexico, what's happening, not everyone is like that. A lot of people ask me, like, oh, like, is Mexico bad? Like, is it really bad? Because I've heard stories on what's happening with, like, the Zetas, and I don't know why. I'm like, I mean, it has its places, but, I mean, Mexico City is beautiful. If you go to Mexico City, it's just gorgeous. So there's just, like, little prejudices that rise up within each group. And, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm wondering how many of you have ever felt personally a victim of racism? Show of hands. Anyone ever really feel like they've been racially profiled? Okay, these are the hands I kind of expected to see, and probably the white people you expected to see those hands as well, which says something about the culture that we grew up in. That if I can look at a classroom of white students and think, oh, these kids have probably never been racially profiled, we probably know what the majority race is in the United States. So, this is the textbook definition, or actually of a different philosophist about racism. Basically what he's saying in here is considering the physical makeup of people, the biological makeup, we're considering one superior to another. So I know that I have white skin, and perhaps that makes me better than someone else because biologically that was the way I was created. It doesn't take into account your culture or your preferences, but on your physical appearance, what about that makes that better than others? Particularly here in the United States, we don't see tons of it in our faces every day. Like, we had the Civil War, we had the Civil Rights Movement, and there'll be times where you encounter it, but the truth is that we deal with other types of isms. We deal with debates about whether women are equal to men and homosexuality and things like that. And so it's not often that we have real talks about racism anymore until recently, when there have been all those accounts in the South of unjust police actions to kids on the street or things like that. The primary things to know are that racism is driven by culture, economics, psychology, and history. Those are all pretty basic, but I think history is a key one to think on. Most philosophers would tell you when they're studying children that racism is a thing that is learned, not innate. So you won't find a kid who really will be like, oh, the little black boy over there. He'll be like, my friend Evan, or the kid in the red shirt. He'll point out something else other than race, unless he's in a culture where that's the way that people are defined. You can look at institutional racism based on the way that a company will hire people. Legally in the United States, you're not allowed to discriminate based on race when you're hiring. But if you work for a private company or something, you might encounter something like that. Or, I worked at a Mexican restaurant last summer, and everyone was Mexican except for they hired the white girl to do the forms for the banking. So that's institutional racism. Like, hey, we need a white girl to go into our bank, and that's something that they created for themselves. So you'll have institutional racism or personal, which is that prejudice that you develop inside of yourself. And here's what the text, I don't want to roll my eyes at the textbook, but the textbook talked about racism and then went on to talk about what we can do to kind of short-circuit it and curtail it, and basically said, don't laugh at racist jokes. And that was their aid for racism. And I get that it's not something that we often encounter and you need to be culturally aware. But I think the thing that's more important to be aware of is the way that racism affects both parties involved. Not only is it derogatory to the people that you're saying are lesser, but also to you as it creates social division. Like any cohesion that you had in the United States in the 1960s divided by racism. Whether that was you as the superior or you as the minority, it was just, you lost all cohesion. And I think the important thing to remember about it is that here's what I think that the textbook missed out on when they were talking about racism. Whether you grew up in the United States or not, I think that you have an opportunity to overlook racism because it's not something that you encounter. Most of you didn't raise your hands when you were talking about racial profiling. But this is a term that I'm going to bring up, and I think that you have a greater potential to ismize anything and not notice that it's a form of racism. So here's a story. A girl I know is a missionary, and she went to China. And while she was in China, she struck up this great relationship with a young woman named Mai. Mai was like 22, trying to learn English, so wanted to be best friends with Julie, this missionary. And so they're developing this relationship, talking about Jesus. Mai is hearing it for the first time. It's great. They're on a bus, and my friend Julie is like, well, do you want to, pray? And I was like, yeah, I want to pray. I want to get to know Jesus. So, in her broken English, she is trying to pray for the first time. And she's standing there, and she's like, I don't know how to pray. And they're on the city bus in China. And she is just struggling. Doesn't know how, and is worked up to the point of tears, oh, I can't pray. I can't pray. I don't know the words. And Julie has this, aha moment, and is like, Mai, do you know that God speaks Mandarin? You can pray to him in Mandarin. And Mai bursts into tears and is like, he speaks Mandarin? He'll speak Mandarin to me? Julie didn't intend to do this, and we don't ever, but she had ismized the way that God relates to people. God probably relates to her in English because an English speaker spoke about God in English. So while you may not be racist against Chinese people, if you're talking to them not very aware of the mindset, you have the potential to create a division between even that person and God. Thankfully Julie was able to say, Mai, it's okay. You can pray in Mandarin. But if we're not aware of that, we might miss that. This is a quote from Maya Angelou, who was a big speaker on racism as she was growing up. But basically how racism is a plague that invades people's mindsets, the same that any sort of virus would, and is a sickness that can take down a whole culture. A study about this, there was a woman by the name of Jane Elliott, and she ran a study in a classroom in the 1960s, the week that Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. The school is in Iowa, which is fitting because I'm from there. But I'm just kidding. I didn't do this. But she took a classroom of third graders and decided she was going to walk in there and they needed to have a real hands-on lesson about racism. Because they had talked about it, but it wasn't happening, and one of their heroes was Martin Luther King, and then he was shot, so what are they going to do? They're third graders. She walked in and decided that she was going to treat all the blue-eyed kids better than the brown-eyed kids. And she set up this segregation classroom for a day. And within a day, an incredible change happened between the students. So we're just going to watch parts of this, but first she's going to introduce what she did and why, and then we'll watch a little piece of the classroom.
This was the third time Jane Elliott had taught her lesson in discrimination. The first, 2 years earlier, was in April of 1968.
On the day after Martin Luther King was killed, one of my students came into the room and said, "They shot a king last night, Mrs. Elliott. Why'd they shoot that king?" I knew the night before that it was time to deal with this in a concrete way, not just talk about it, because we had talked about racism since the first day of school. But the shooting of Martin Luther King, who had been one of our heroes of the month in February, could not just be talked about and explained away. There was no way to explain this to little third graders in Riceville, Iowa. As I listened to the white male commentators on TV the night before, I was hearing things like, who's going to hold your people together as they interviewed black leaders? What are they going to do? Who's going to control your people as though...
So there, she goes on to talk about the social division that she was seeing even being taught through the news. And she just said that I don't think that the words we're using are really, like, they're as divisive as the actions we're taking. So she decided to take kind of a really harsh approach for teaching third graders. So, I mean, teacher candidates in the room, maybe don't do this, but it was effective.
Sweet home. This is a special week. Does anybody know what it is? National Brotherhood Week. What's brotherhood?
Be kind to your brother.
Okay, be kind to your brothers.
Like you would like to be treated.
Treat everyone the way you would like to be treated. Treat everyone as though he was your brother. And is there anyone in this United States that we do not treat as our brothers?
Yes.
Who?
Yes.
The black people. Who else?
And
Absolutely the Indians. And when many people see a black person or a yellow person or a red person, what do they think?
look at that.
And look at the dumb people. What else do they think sometimes? What kinds of things do they say about black people?
They're niggers.
In the city, many places in the United States, how are black people treated? How are Indians treated? How are people who are of a different color than we are
I'm
treated?
going to skip ahead just a little bit so you can see her interact with the kids.
Are you sure? My dad's blue-eyed. He's never kicked me.
At this point, she said that blue-eyed
He's
people
never
are
kicked
better.
him. Chris's dad is blue-eyed. He's never kicked him. This is a fact. Blue-eyed people are better than brown-eyed people. Are you brown-eyed or blue-eyed?
No.
Why are you shaking your head? Are you sure that you're right? Why? What makes you so sure that you're right?
I don't know.
The blue-eyed people get 5 extra minutes of recess, while the brown-eyed people have to stay in. The brown-eyed people do not get to use the drinking fountain. You'll have to use the paper cups. You brown-eyed people are not to play with the blue-eyed people on the playground because you are not as good as blue-eyed people. Well, the brown-eyed people in this room today are going to wear collars so that we can tell from a distance what color your eyes are. On page 127. 127. Is everyone ready? Everyone but Laurie. Ready, Laurie? She's a brown-eyed. You'll begin to notice today that we spend a great deal of time waiting for brown-eyed people.
I wish we had time to show more of the whole clip because she gets really mean with these kids. And she does it throughout the span of the whole day.
Well, he did.
Were you doing it?
Right now at this time, they've been out to recess. It's several hours later in the day, and while they were outside, the blue-eyed kids were, like, verbally abusing the brown-eyed kids, even though earlier in the day it had changed. So she's pushing them now, and she starts to say, well, why did you do that? Why were you doing that to them? And he's like, well, because they have brown eyes. And she's like, well, what does that mean? And he goes, well, that means that they're stupid. So these kids just turned into, like, monsters by the end of this session. And she comments on that, and then the very next day, she goes and she does the same thing in reverse. So you would think that this wouldn't really work because they were there the day before. But it does. She walks in and she goes, well, I was wrong. You know, it turns out brown-eyed people are better. And there happens to be a little boy that has blue eyes that forgot his glasses, and he goes, and she's like, well, so-and-so, a brown-eyed boy didn't forget his glasses. This brown-eyed boy doesn't even need glasses. And is just equally mean the opposite way. And they relearn racism the opposite way. She's done the same experiment in university. She's done it with adults. We just watched an interview earlier today of her, like, really old speaking to a university, and kids breaking down in tears at the fact that they could, like, feel this racism coming out, but it wasn't fair, but they didn't have anything to do. And so it's this whole concept of how racism is more substantially taught and learned and provoked than it is something that kids are innate with. And it's so interesting how she was able to reverse it. The last bit, we don't have as much time for this discussion as we hope, but the last bit is ethnocentrism, which you could consider cultural racism. So the idea that one culture is superior to another, using your own culture as a starting base for it. So basically being like, oh, well, the American way or the Midwestern way of doing this is better than the Southern way of doing this, or the Eastern European way of government is better than Western European. And we think of big examples of that, of like really significant things, like maybe Christianity is better than Judaism or something like that. But there's also examples of it that are a little more subtle. So if I say, oh man, that guy was driving on the wrong side of the road, what side of the road was he driving on? The left side. Whereas if you were in England, that man is doing just fine, and he should probably stay on the left side of the road if that's the way he needs to be headed. And there's a bunch of different examples on here. But let's see. What standards should be considered if you, this is kind of an interesting one, but if you are getting ready to be married, if there's a girl that's getting ready to be married, and you're thinking, I don't know, is she ready for marriage? What things would you think about?
How old is she?
How old she is? Anything else?
She finished college.
She finished college? Is she financially stable? All that kind of stuff. What the guy is like that she's going to marry. I went to Nicaragua, and we on a mission trip, and we had women in the church helping us do our laundry and helping us to cook. And they had been asking us, oh, like, are you married? Are you married? And I was 17, and I was the oldest. And I was like, no, none of us are married. None of us are married. And they were like, oh, that's kind of weird. So later, I go over there, and my translator is like, hey, Kira would like to know how you make this rice. Will you, like, show her how to make rice? And they didn't know that I spoke any Spanish. And they turned to each other and started laughing, and they were like, no wonder she's not married. She can't do her laundry or cook. Because they had totally different standards for what a girl should be able to do when she gets married. And I was like, that's fair. But in my mind, I'm ready to be defensive, like, well, I have a job, and I paid my own way here, and I can read. But it just wasn't part of their ethnocentric culture. So there's good sides to it. The positive side is that it keeps people driving on the right side of the road. So it creates a sense of identity and belonging. When it comes to war times, people will gear up for their country. There's a negative side of it where you can be competitive and get a little mean, but that tends to not be damaging. But then when we get into cultural racism, it's a negative side of things where you really believe yourself to be superior and other methods to be inferior. So that was really quick, and there's other things that you could talk about in there, but as a whole, cultural identity is the product of what created you, but can be easily influenced by lots of other factors. Do you guys have any questions? Okay. Done.
Remember to send me a video, send me that video, please, and also upload your PowerPoint onto the 2 hours. That way everybody gets access. Good job. We will come back